Well, good morning, everyone. I think we will make a start to the session so that we can actually be on time. This is Apops 2, and I would like to introduce the session chairs, Warwick Mitchell and Yoshinobu Matsuzaki. Over to you two. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. We'd like to welcome you today to Apops 2. There's a few housekeeping notes. Firstly, just a reminder, there is a code of conduct and that is published on the Apricot website and will be noted in the chat window as well shortly. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom session that you can use to ask questions or to make a comment about the presentations you're about to see. Please use the Zoom chat for any questions you have about the event. And please note there's also help available on the Apricot website if you would like to go and comment there. And finally, please don't forget to actually take a photo and share it on social media with the hashtag Apricot2021. Finally, if there's any questions that haven't been answered over the course of this Zoom session, please email the secretariat at apricot.net and it will be forwarded to the speaker so that they can get back to you. And with that, I'll hand over to my colleague, Maz, to continue on.
Oh, thank you very much, Warwick. So let's move to the actual session. So we have three speakers today. The first up is Jeff Houston. So the problem is we have only 20 minutes for you, including Q&A. So Jeff, over to you.
Thanks a lot. And my apologies for dropping out yesterday. The folk installing the solar panels on my roof were having too much fun with electricity and the entire power to the house dropped out. But they assure me it's all done now. We will see. So yes, I know I have a small amount of time. So I want to talk today about BGP in 2020. So firstly, I just want to confirm that you can actually see my screen. Is that true, Maz? Yes?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, I've only got 15 minutes and I got way too many slides. So what I did was I pulled out the ones that were important. For all the rest, go and see the full slide pack in the conference proceedings or wherever it may be. But I'll just run through an edited highlight summary of what happened in the routing system. The routing system actually charts the internet. This is a view of 27 years of the IPv4 routing table in BGP, starting when we introduced classless interdomain routing way back in 1994. And firstly, Merit was picking up this data, looking at the size of the routing table every few hours. And then the good folk at the University of Oregon with their Route Views project started doing this for a whole bunch of peers across the ensuing years. It's amazing. You can actually see the boom and bust of the year 2000. There was the bust. You can actually see the rise of DSL. Fascinatingly, what you can't see is address exhaustion, which started to occur in 2011. And in V4, it's been going on forever, but the BGP table doesn't seem to know. Over the last 2 years, I've added actually all of the peers of RIPE's RIS service and mashed them together with the data from Route Views. So this is the combined view over a couple of hundred peers. Every 6 hours, there's a new data point. That's a lot of data inside those colors. What's interesting is that not everyone sees the same routing system. There's a small amount of divergence between every single view of routing. Some see more, some see less. But you see the colors are constant. The folk who see more always see more. The folk who see less tend to always see less. Yeah, that's routing for you. Average growth trend looks a bit linear. But what can we say as well? Why is it still growing? Well, I actually looked at the size of the address pool, not in routes, but in real addresses. And it's kind of interesting. The RIRs who ran out of free V4 addresses some years ago actually still allocated 2.3 million addresses last year. What was going on? Well, there's a little bit of churn. In APNIC's case, there was actually a release of space previously marked as reserved that started to be allocated. And other RIRs are also looking inside various very small back pockets, if they have anything, and actually letting it through. So in the last year, some 2.3 million addresses. The big shift was this continuous dredging of unallocated addresses. And there are a lot of unadvertised addresses, excuse me. There are a lot of unadvertised addresses in the routing system, up to around 50/8s. Last year, over the course of the year, by the end of the year, the unadvertised address pool had actually dropped by 14.5 million and become advertised. And if you add that to the 2.3 or 2.2 or whatever rounding error allocated by the RIRs, you actually see that the address space announced in BGP grew by about a /8. So what happened? Well, you wouldn't even know address exhaustion had happened in some respects. It's just business as usual. The growth is largely linear, 52,000 new entries last year, 3,400 new ASs last year. I've talked about this before, by the way, but that's not an Asian thing. It's an American and European thing. Almost 60%, 60 to 70% of all new ASs come from the Northern Hemisphere over in that part of the world and not over from the Asia Pacific. Differing models, I suppose. But what's the growth? Well, there's not an awful lot of new addresses. And those 52,000 new entries is largely because we're applying finer and finer slicing to advertised address prefixes. And little by little, we're getting to the point where every single routed address will be routed as a /24. And then we'll start going to 25s and 26s. So that's why it's still growing, that by and large, what we're doing is advertising finer and finer granularity as we move on in terms of address exhaustion and the use of NATs. That was V4. What about V6? Well, not quite the same period, since we only really started extensive measurements of this in January 2004, which is when RouteView started. And you can actually see a very slight blip in 2011, which was the time of IANA IPv4 exhaustion. But it was actually, there were a couple of promotions of World IPv6 something or other, days, weeks, months, that did cause some slight change in the V6 routing table in terms of size. But by and large, the long-term trend is actually increasing growth, not steady growth. So is it exponential? Is it polynomial? Well, that's something we'll deal with a little bit later. But by and large, what you're seeing is not linear. This is accelerating growth at the moment. And we're now reaching that magical point a few weeks ago where most folk in route views were seeing 100,000 entries in the V6 routing table. Woohoo! The last 2 years in detail, around 60,000 24 months ago, around 100,000 now. You also notice that 2 years ago, there was much tighter grouping. Everyone saw roughly the same size routing table. Now it's opening out. Do some people filter /64s? Well, probably. Do they filter /48s? Considering 2/3 of the routing table is /48s, that would be a rather silly thing to do, but it might well happen. But you notice now we're seeing a bit like V4, a much higher degree of variance in what individual views of BGP see. Summarizing it, not 54,000 entries, less than half. The growth rate is 25,000 entries per year. So it's growing, but not at the same speed as V4, but it's increasing growth. And the reason why is, yes, more networks with more prefixes, but at the same time, there's this increasing use to advertise more specifics as well as the aggregate. And little by little, all of the problems we saw in pollution of the routing table in V4, more specifics that seemed like senseless vandalism, is now actually a feature of V6. I suppose this is the true mark of V6 coming of age, that we're abusing it to the same way that we abuse V4. Obviously, it's now mature. Moving right on along, because time is moving on, FIB projections. How big is it going to get? The full slide pack has all the details of first order differentials and maths and stuff, but the best model I can find is linear. Current growth rate, 54,000 entries per year. If we meet again in 2026, will it be at 1,100,000 entries? and we'll cross that boundary point into 1 million entries in the fib table in V4 in 2024, at the start of 2024. Look forward to that. I'm sure your routers are already. What about V6? A little bit harder. It's not linear. So we can put a lower bound on that number because it's not linear. So by 2024, when the V4 routing table is 1 million, at a lower bound, the V6 table will be 155,000. It's more likely to be some model of exponential. And the best curve fit I can put on the data, using 2 years to drive it, is one that sees it doubling, every 4 years, something like that. So by 2024, we're going to get to 228,000 entries. Now, don't forget, these are 128-bit entries. V4 is only 32-bit entries. So we'll get to around parity, where you're going to need the same amount of space to store a V6 fib as a V4 fib in 2024. Note that this is eBGP, not IBGP. If you have a whole bunch of internal routes, add them in. I'm not. I'm just looking at the large interdomain system. But I suppose the interesting news is that exponential trend, coupled with the fact that each entry is 4 times the size of V4, should give you pause for thought, because these are starting to get big numbers very quickly, even though the underlying table size is nowhere near that of V4 yet. So I think I just said all that. So let's move on. Churn. It's not just how big you are, it's what you do with it. So in V4, we've seen an interesting history of the number of updates that I see. Now, everyone sees something different. AS 131072 is a stub AS that I operate at the edge of the network, like many stubs at the edge of the network. I'm not carrying transit. I don't have an awful lot of feeds. It's just a simple little stub network, like the other 65,000 ASs out there. And so while your picture might not be the same as this, it will be pretty similar. Oddly enough, right up until around 2013, the number of updates was astonishingly stable. Didn't vary even though the routing table grew. Interesting. And then across the space of about 12 months, the number of updates doubled. Not the number of withdrawals, just the number of updates. The routing table didn't do much, but the number of updates doubled. And then it stayed steady for some years. And then my collector died for a few weeks. But in 2019, something strange happened again. Because while the routing table just grew at its linear rate, the number of updates very quickly grew from 100,000 to 200,000 to 300,000. And during the last few months of 2020, I'm getting 500,000 updates a second, not withdrawals. And indeed, the number of withdrawals is falling. The number of updates, something is happening. Why am I worried? Well, I'm worried because in some ways, this is the speed of the routing protocol to perform, the amount of time it takes to converge a routing update. So for many years, it was below 50 seconds, below. As the network grew and we had that little uptake in updates, it steadied at around 50 seconds to converge. But over the last 18 months, it's growing again. It's pushing 2 minutes. And indeed, the last few weeks of 2020, the average time to converge is up around 3 minutes, not 40 seconds, but 3 minutes. That's an issue. That's an issue for all of us, because if this really impacts on the performance of BGP, we're going to have to do something. So what would I say in summary? The beginnings of concern. We're now getting to the point where this network is not as stable as it used to be, but it's not everyone's fault. We can name them. 5% of all the origin networks are linked to 80% of all the updates. So what's going on, people, is that a small amount of you are behaving really, really badly, far more badly than you used to, and everyone else is paying the pain. So in some ways, the pathological cases, the instability for a very small minority is now starting to totally dominate the entire internet. I run an instability report that names them. And if you want to see if you're on the name list or not, have a look at the BGP instability report. Let's move to V6. Well, it was always bad, always worse than V4. I had to make this a log scale because it couldn't fit in a linear scale. It's that bad. And you notice in the last few months, whoa, more than an average of 1 million updates a day. And unlike V4, the number of withdrawals is also rising, albeit slowly, but rising, getting close to around 10,000 withdrawals a day, up to the V4 levels. So V6 is kind of getting less stable over the years, visibly so. And what does that mean in convergence? I'm like, it was always kind of bad. But in 2018 and 2019, we thought we had our act together. You know, we'd sort of stopped all these stupid overlays and tunneling and tunnel brokers and this and that. And sort of the network worked for a while. But in 2020, whatever you learned, you forgot. And here we are again with up to 300 seconds to converge on average on some of the worst days in 2020. Not good. Why is it worse? Well, my suspicion is it's all about the dual stack world. And it's all about what you are conditioned to do. I think if you're in routing, you obsessively look at V4 and you obsessively ignore V6. How else can you explain it? Because what's going on is the V6 network exhibits this extraordinary routing instability, but no one looks. And as the old overlay approaches disappear, in theory, we should be behaving the same as V4. It's the same topology. But just 5 ASs in Brazil generate 30% of the BGP update load in the last 2 weeks. I'm like, Brazil, what's the story? I'm like, all of this instability we're seeing, this is a cumulative distribution graph. That peak there is in a tiny number of pathologically insane activities in BGP. Stop it, clean it up, reboot your router, do something. But what you're doing is incredible damage. So some conclusions. So we have a couple of seconds for questions. We're stuck with BGP forever. There's little in the way of scaling pressure on the protocol itself. We actually lucked out with BGP as being a remarkably good interdomain routing protocol. And quite frankly, if you keep the link stable, BGP is pretty effective. But the instability levels are rising, driven by a small set of extremely unstable super generators. If we got rid of them, the network would be incredibly stable and I wouldn't have anything to talk about. The only other thing you've got to worry about is your fib size and your line speeds, because as the line speed costs rise, memory costs rise, the amount of effort you need to go to allow this enormous forwarding table to be put inside your router is going to cost and cost and cost and cost and cost. I expect we're going to see architectures of high-speed routers move into hot caching, where you put a tiny number of heavily used routes in a really fast line speed cache in the line cards and dump everything else into a much slower process using basically cheaper, slower memory. This, I think, will be the norm in the coming years because the routing table is not going to stop growing in any time soon. So what should you do? Have a look at your fib capacity. Look at it and understand it. And understand that we're going to need a lot more space in the next coming years than you've probably got installed in your units. So you're really going to have to think about either upgrading or changing the way you're doing routing architecture. And one of the ways to change it is default is your friend. You know, if you've got a network that's amenable to putting default in various places, put it in. It certainly reduces the load on the routing and the memory systems and actually makes packet forwarding performance a whole bunch better. Hot caching is also going to make things better. So that's it from me. There's probably, in fact, there is a few seconds for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Actually, we have 2 questions already. So first up is Rob Thomas. You mentioned seeing /25 and /26 in the global table. Do you really expect to start to see those in the global table in the next N years?
Yes. Money is a wonderful thing. If you're my customer, you can do anything you want if you pay me. We're seeing a lot of pressure on the V4 system. And because of various forms of heavily compressed NAT technologies, we're actually putting and stuffing more and more customers behind smaller and smaller prefixes. The desperation of exhaustion is showing. You know, you can see the whites of our eyes. And if that means we're going to start pushing 26s through the global routing table, so be it. It's not the end of the world. If you really want to think about the end of the world, think about the fact that we're allowing /48s in V6. How many /48s are there? A whole lot more than there are /32s. If we're going to die a horrible death, it's not going to be because of /25s and 26s, let me assure you. So this whole line in the sand about 24s is actually a line in sand that is 30 years old. It's not a problem. Why don't we route 25s, 26s and so on? Because we drew a line in the sand 30 odd years ago. It's not a line for today. So yes, that's what's going to happen. We're going to route finer and finer. Absolutely.
Thank you. Next question is dampening going to help with BGP IPv6 variability, or do we need something more harsh to control update spans?
Dampening won't help this, Terry. Dampening is all about the number of updates to converge, not the time to converge. What dampening does is try and suppress all that distance vector protocol exploring as it tries to reach a new stable state. And in some ways, the timer around convergence is your MRI timer that sits inside BGP. So whether you route flat damp or not actually makes no difference to the time to get all those updates flushed out and get the distance protocol back to a stable state. So in terms of the highly volatile updaters, the stick you're going to have to use is not just change the protocol, because damping isn't the answer. You're going to have to look at who's doing it and hit them. So yeah.
Thank you very much. So the last question for this talk is, should we stop RIRs allocating /48?
We've never talked about this as a community, but it's certainly true that we don't have routing equipment if everyone routed a /32 in V6. We really, really don't have the routing equipment if everyone routed a /48. We really, really, really don't have, if everyone routed /128s. In some ways, this isn't an allocation problem. It's not. It really is an issue around how we view routing and how we view aggregation as a routing principle. Now, we've taken the easy way out for years. We've relied on the address allocation system to allocate large enough blocks and then frown on people who disaggregate and split them up, even though the reality is that half of the routing table in V4 is more specifics, and now half the routing table in V6 is more specifics. So in some ways, our allocation policies don't make an ounce of difference in routing. And so changing the allocation policies won't change routing. So if you want to stop or change the behavior in routing and change the behavior of all these fine-grained prefixes, you've actually got to use a different mechanism, whatever that might be. But then you've got to think about, what are you trying to do here and achieve? A lot of folk put out more specifics as a sort of a DDoS or a hijack defense. You can't put a more specific on me because I've beaten you to it and I've advertised the more specific anyway. I win, which is crazy, but true. And maybe it's those kinds of attitudes to routing. The default network operator's handbook, step 20, advertise all the more specifics you can. Maybe we should be looking at that and actually looking at how we control the routing system as an environment, because I don't think the allocators, the RIR policies, are the root cause here. I think the issue around all of this needless routing vandalism is actually a bunch of pretty bad practices that we've never critically evaluated for decades, because we just haven't.
Thank you very much.
Back to you, Maz.
Jeff.
Cheers.
Okay, now we have our second speaker, Charmaine Yoon from Telegeography. She will talk about Asia Pacific Networks 2020, and we have recorded video. So can you play the video? Yep. Shermaine is
Hello everyone,
joined
I'm
the
Shermaine from
session, so
Telegeography.
she can take a Q&A after all.
I'm the Asia Pacific Research Analyst, and today I'll be sharing a presentation on some data and trends that we're seeing in the Asia Pacific networks that we saw last year in 2020. So here's an overview of my presentation today. First, we will look at the impact of COVID-19 among carriers in the region, specifically how carriers have responded to the pandemic last year, as well as how internet bandwidth and traffic has been affected because of that. I'll then talk a bit about overall internet bandwidth trends that we have seen in the region in recent years, how bandwidth usage, network deployment, and connectivity has been changing. And I'll then share about how this relates to the colocation and on-ramp scene in the region. And I'll also talk a bit about our IP transit pricing data and trends in Asia Pacific hubs. Lastly, I hope to offer some insights about how the Asia Pacific network will look like moving forward past 2020. So as we all know, 2020 had been a year where the global economy had been disrupted. There's no exception to the telecommunications industry. The occurrence of COVID-19 meant that consumers used bandwidth in larger amounts and also in a different manner, leading to carriers and providers having to make adjustments to their deployment of And so in this presentation, I hope to be able to provide some insights to some of these unknowns that the industry has. With COVID-19 and everyone's shift in working and schooling from home, I'm sure we all know that the traffic has surged in networks. And in response, operators in Asia deployed a variety of measures to cope with the traffic spike. And so we surveyed carriers in Asia about the measures they've taken to deal with this sudden change. All carriers surveyed have adopted at least one of the measures listed here to cope with their network. And peering was the most common measure taken, where 100% of carriers actually indicated that they did so. Increasing IP transit purchases was the second most common measure taken in face of the pandemic-induced traffic as well. But now, if you think about it, we know that carriers have been increasing their internet bandwidth deployment across the years already. And so in 2020, carriers are likely to have planned to increase these respective purchases and capacities already anyway, even if COVID did not happen. So we will need to know and discern how much of the internet bandwidth increase is actually due to COVID-19 and how much of it might already have happened anyway, even without the pandemic. So aside from our bandwidth trend analysis, we also conduct forecasts for how internet bandwidth grows. So we did a calculation on how the observed growth of internet bandwidth in 2020 exceeded our forecasted internet bandwidth growth. And with that, we can then discern what portion of 2020's growth may be due to the impact of COVID-19. And in other words, so given how much we thought bandwidth was going to grow, we can then deduce in 2020 with COVID-19 how many more percentage of growth had been experienced by the region due to the pandemic. And so this data was collected and reported in Q2 of 2020. And what we observed is that COVID-19 actually accelerated Asia's bandwidth growth by 4% and 12% in Oceania. These differences in bandwidth growth could imply that, for instance, in Asia, Asian operators had initially planned to add an extra 36% of bandwidth in Asia, but in the end had ended up increasing their bandwidth by 41% to cope with the unplanned surge in traffic. And also, aside from bandwidth, it's important to consider the peak traffic growth that's alongside with the carrier's decision to increase their bandwidth. Across global regions here, we can see that from COVID-19, the peak traffic has grown faster than bandwidth did. Specifically in Asia, peak traffic grew by 51%, when bandwidth grew by only 41%. And in Oceania, peak traffic grew by 50%, while bandwidth grew by 39%. And so the implication here of traffic growing faster than bandwidth in Asia Pacific is that networks are now running hotter than usual and they are more utilized than before. And as such, there is a potential that we could see a continued elevated batch of bandwidth growth in 2021 this year, if operators would seek to return their networks to pre-pandemic levels of network utilization. And so let's take a look at the bigger picture of the overall trends that we're seeing in Asia Pacific in the past 5 years. The compound annual growth rate of Asia in the past 5 years was 40% in terms of international internet bandwidth consumption. It recorded 148 terabytes. That's more than 13% of what the whole of North America consumes, making Asia the second fastest growing region in the world after Africa. Oceania, on the other hand, experienced a 34% compound annual growth rate in the past 5 years, placing its growth rate above global average and reaching 7.7 terabytes in 2020. In the charts here, we can see the connectivity within Asia Pacific region. So the pink bars here represent the percentage of connectivity to Asia. The light blue aqua bars represent the percentage of connectivity to Oceania. And lastly, the dark blue bars at the bottom, they represent the connectivity across the Pacific to the US and Canada. On the left chart, we can see that just 6 years ago, intra-Asian internet bandwidth connectivity, which is the pink bars, took up actually just less than half the region's total international internet bandwidth usage. But it grew steadily across the past years. And in 2020, its share of Asia's connectivity has actually overtaken the trans-Pacific connectivity to North America. And similarly, on the right, we can see that Oceania's connectivity in the region is also growing. While it is relatively small compared to Asia, it is important to note Oceania's steadily increasing share of interconnectivity within the Asia-Pacific region. In 2020, Oceania's connectivity within the Asia-Pacific region took up half of the region's total connectivity, compared to 5 years ago when it took up only 30%. And in Asia, Hong Kong, Japan, and Singapore continue to act as the region's internet hubs. The largest trans-Pacific routes from US to Canada are connected between the US and Hong Kong, and as well as Japan. And Singapore, being geographically located within Southeast Asia, is also well connected to many other Asian countries. And while there are clear large hubs in Asia Pacific, let's look at how they compare to one another, as well as the rest of the cities that are in their connectivity. So Singapore dominates Asia Pacific with the highest internet bandwidth usage. Its usage is actually more than 2.7 times more than Tokyo and 1.6 times of Hong Kong. And while Singapore has been growing faster than Hong Kong and Tokyo, its growth rate is actually quite a lot less than other growing economies like Jakarta and Hanoi. Those markets are also booming with their maturing economies. In fact, in 2020, the Jakarta-Singapore route had overtaken the US-Singapore route to be the largest route recorded in Asia. And while Manila's international internet bandwidth consumption is not as high compared to its surrounding neighbors yet, it is noteworthy that its growth rate is comparable to that of Singapore. It is growing at a relatively rapid rate, faster than the two other dominant primary hubs like Hong Kong and Tokyo. So this brings me to my next point, that connectivity within Asia Pacific has also been experiencing strong growth. So historically, the trans-Pacific routes connecting Asian hubs to the United States have always been the largest routes. And the China-US routes, which is inclusive of Hong Kong and largely coming from Hong Kong, was the largest route in the region in the past decade. While these routes are continuing to grow, their growth rates are now slower than a few intra-Asian routes. And as I've just mentioned, for the first time ever in 2020, an intra-Asian route overtook the trans-Pacific route to be the largest route in the region, recording close to 15 terabytes on its own. The compounded annual growth rate on this Singapore-Indonesia route in the past 5 years recorded at a stunning 91%, whereas trans-Pacific routes, while still growing, have a compounded growth rate of below 30%. The China-Vietnam route as well as Singapore-Vietnam routes are also growing at a rapid rate of 71% and 87% respectively. And it is unsurprising that the largest hubs in Asia is also where the largest colocation markets are at. The three largest hubs in Asia are Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Singapore, and they are featured in the top 10 largest colocation markets globally. So Tokyo is the largest with 10.3 million square feet of gross retail capacity, ahead of Washington, which is the second largest market by 2 million. And nearly 40% of the colocation space in Tokyo are accounted for by activities of the NTT group. Hong Kong is also growing faster than the second largest market, Washington, with 66 sites located in it. Following that, we also see that most on-ramps in Asia are located where bandwidth is congregated. Tokyo is also the hub with the most number of on-ramp services to major cloud service providers. So it recorded a total of 16 on-ramps as of Q1 of 2021. And now Mumbai and Singapore follow second with 12 on-ramps each as of this quarter as well. While Mumbai is not a major internet hub that we saw in Asia Pacific among those that we saw earlier, it is definitely a rising secondary hub that is rapidly growing and developing. And Alibaba has the most number of on-ramps in Asia. Although its highest concentration is within mainland China, it is also growing not just within China, but also the region and globally. Its number of on-ramps is almost double of that of Amazon, which has the second most number of on-ramps in Asia hubs. We're also seeing IBM, a relatively smaller player, entering it. Looking at Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Singapore, which are cities that are important to regional traffic exchange, we can see that higher capacity IP transit services are gaining the most traction. So while 10 gig services continue to represent the largest portions of carriers' reported sales mix, 100G technology is also becoming increasingly prominent in Asia's IP transit market. And so 100 gig IP transit sales have also naturally followed. In Singapore, 100 gig prices are just at 40 cents per megabytes after dropping 39% in the past 3 years. As larger numbers of carriers deploy 100G technology across the IP networks, the premium that's associated with 100 gig card cost also continues to decline. And we expect prices to continue to erode as well. In general, prices have fallen across Asia, but the region is characterized by a unique mix of markets. So besides the international network hubs that we've just seen, there are also many other developing markets and maturing economies in Asia. And in these geographies, what drives connectivity costs is the cost of accessing internet hubs like Singapore or the US through underlying subsea capacity. And so in secondary markets in Asia, we are largely also seeing falling prices. For example, in India, the constructions of new international capacity to Europe and Asia are driving down connectivity costs. The fastest growing markets, Indonesia and Thailand, while they still maintain high prices, relatively high prices at $7 and $5 per megabytes, which is 9 and 6 times higher than Singapore, respectively. It's starting to change as a growing number of providers are now actually establishing POPs in Bangkok and Jakarta to offer direct connectivity to end users. And regional cable systems are also bolstering supply and lowering underlying wavelength prices to both countries. However, there are some exceptions. So in Seoul, government regulations that mandate commercial terms of domestic interconnection and peering as well have actually kept IP transit at a premium. A word of caution here is that pricing reported are at weighted median levels, specifically of 10 gig E prices. So this is all I have for today. I'd like to close up with a few concluding statements and observations about the Asia Pacific market moving forward. The first one I have here is that, as we've seen in the beginning of this presentation, Asia Pacific carriers have managed to cope with the impact of the pandemic by employing a wide variety of measures. We saw that Asian carriers we surveyed had to deploy at least one measure in coping traffic surges. and peering was the most popular option that all Asian carriers we surveyed had partaken in. Secondly, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Tokyo will remain as dominant hubs in Asia Pacific, but there are increasing focus to develop secondary hubs in the region as demand growth remains strong. And thirdly, while there are postponements to several submarine cables to Hong Kong, which have led to some providers focusing on alternative trans-Pacific routes, it's important to keep in mind that intra-Asian cables to the city are still planned, and intra-Asian internet bandwidth demand is growing at a rate that is actually faster than trans-Pacific routes. Lastly, while we observe that price erosion continues, it remains constant and is within our expected bounds, which suggests to us that the pandemic has thus far not caused significant disruption to pricing schemes. Thank you very much for your time today. If you have any questions at all or feedback about my presentation, please feel free to drop me a note at my email below, and have a good day ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Charmaine. Is there any question for her? So if we have, please type into the Q&A box on the Zoom. As she's participating in this session, so she can answer directly, but if not, thank you very much. So now we are going to the third talk, the third and the last speaker, Danny Pinto. He will speak on approaching 1000K. So Danny, are you ready?
Yeah.
Yep, over to you. Yes.
Good. How are you doing on time, Maz?
You have 20 minutes, including Q&A.
Good. I like my laser. Okay.
Yep.
Good. Let's roll. Approaching 1 million or 1024K. Are there limits on the internet that can cause some incidents? Hi, I'm Danny Pinto. I run packet engineering for Colt. Colt is a global connectivity provider headquartered in London. I'm based in Bangalore, India. So we're going to really look at a flashback on the 512K event that happened 6 years back. We look at Jeff's summary with BGP table size growth and predictions, and what's happening in routing table in network operators, and the implications for network operators from two areas, network hardware, network software, and wrap up with some of the network optimization experiences we're doing at Colt. So flashback 6 years back, August 12, 2014, we had the 512K event. A few minutes before 8 a.m. GMT, there was a 22,000 prefix leak in the global internet, in the Taiwan club, in the DFZ. Routing leaks are not uncommon events. It happens every day, but 22,000 was a big leak. Coincidentally, what happened was the event triggered a 512K fib exhaustion on commonly used router platforms, or should I call it commonly used multi-layer switching platform. And the supplier in this regard had already sent a notification months ahead of time, but many operators didn't take any actions on it, or maybe they didn't know it. So many network operators experienced some incidents due to high CPU, reachability to internet destinations because the routers were resetting, etc. So they had to really adjust the TCAMs and reload the routers and get it back online. The question is, did it cause some chaos on the internet? Chaos can be modeled mathematically for dynamic systems with chaos theory and butterfly effect, but that's for another day. You can have a look at it. But chaos on operator networks depends on where the impact is. Is it on the core of the internet, or how many ASs are impacted? And more importantly, who is impacted? So this great work done by Jeff at the time, and you can look at his blog on the 512K event. Of course, it creates some news. The tech media goes gaga over it. You have internet routing table became unreliable, called the Y2K. Did we have a Y2K? But there's a lot of work done after that, and in RIPE, APNIC, and Emily from RIPE had looked at it and wrote a blog, and it said, like, that's not much a spoiler as such. There were some impacts in different operator networks. 2021, we had Jeff's presentation summarizing the global table size and where we're going with it. And one important thing is we look at the mailing list as network engineers, subscribe to the mailing list, we get a daily or a weekly report, sorry, and most often we ignore it. But post 2014, we started to look at these reports quite seriously. And every year, Jeff has this ritual of writing the BGP report for the previous year. And this year we looked at IPv4, which is at 861K, IPv6 at 109K in Jan 2021. And the report said IPv4 has grown at 6%, IPv6 at 33%. Trends are linear for IPv4. IPv6 may follow an exponential or a polynomial curve. These reports are important because it gives some insights in what happens in operator networks also. So let's take an example of an operator network. You have your own network, which is in blue, and you have a peering router or edge router which connects to the transits or connects into a DFZ, and you have peering sessions in exchange points, and you propagate those routes into your network in whatever topology you run or design you run, core access, aggregation, and you have route reflectors to propagate those topology as per IBGP principles. And you offer internet access services, again, of eBGP to your customers. And some of operators like Colt offer CPEs or managed CPEs for customers also. So the operator network has wide set of devices and wide set of device models. But the operator full table announcements on eBGP, especially towards customers, have differences based on the location or the view. Now, what could possibly also happen is the internal tables of network operators can vary based on design. Right? You could run native IP or MPLS, or you could be having an IGP size higher depending on the number of devices you have and number of customer routes you really have. So while the CIDR reports say about 860K, Cold Table has 894K in January. We already crossed 900K in February now. So the point I want, global table or the routing table of operators can depend upon internet global table and incremental routes they have from the internal routes they have. It could be anywhere from 10K to 100K, maybe for Colt we have around 40K. So that has quite a significant impact on how we approach these limits. So we're talking about two numbers here, 1024K and 128K. The question is, are there any relevance of these numbers with respect to limits or boundaries on networks? 1024K is nothing but 1 million. 1024 multiplied by 1024, this is the exact number you have, 1048576. And 128K is 128 into 1024, that's 131072. And the question I have is, can it cause chaos on the internet? So operators should watch these numbers. And Jeff mentioned about the global table forecast, but possibly different operators will cross these limits somewhere between N22 to N23 in their networks. So again, can the 512K event repeat? Possibly, with network hardware, old and new with some limits, network software configuration limits, or as we progress towards these numbers, there's a large routing table leak which can really breach these limits ahead of time for all the operators at the same time. So possible scenarios, what I call as a butterfly effect of a catastrophic event, which is quite unlikely. Or there are some noticeable events in operator networks at different times in the next 2 years. Or everything is green, operators are managed and optimized ahead of time. So what really happens? So what we're doing at Colt is looking at two broad areas, reviewing our deployment device models for router hardware and silicon architecture limits, and some of the OS configuration and standards we run in our network. Network hardware limits, we had multiple generations of hardware in our networks. So there are fixed architectures, non-modular devices, or you have these modular architectures with central processors and line cards. And just have an example of this view here. You have a root processing system in a centralized system, which has a CPU, and the RIB is really stored on the RAM. And you have a line card, which is expected to run autonomously with the fib downloaded from the RIB, and the packet buffer really doing the packet switching, and you have the media interfaces and other memory components. The point is, operators need to know the hardware architectures better. Your router supplier systems engineers can explain very fancy, shiny slides of each and every router architecture. The important thing is operators need to know the RIB and the fib limits. And the fib limits is becoming more important these days because you started to use the fib not just for IPv4 and IPv6, but you also started to put in ACLs, quality of service policy maps, fancy bells and whistles of SDN, labeled unicast, so forth and so on. So operators need to know the hardware architecture limits that they deploy. More importantly, if you just look at operator networks, and there are router evolution, the high-scale CPU, you go ask your vendor, he will get the best hardware software for scaling it for next 10 years. But operator networks honestly run legacy devices. So you can look at, I'm not putting names here, you can look at it. I think you can know these are running in your networks also. So you have centralized software processing devices right from 2000s. You went to big, fat, expensive routers, taking off-the-rack space with 120 Gbps of packet forwarding. You went with the rat race of merchant silicon. And over time, you settle down for optimized silicon because rental in DC for DC power and space is high, costs are high, so small is beautiful. You put smaller boxes in your network. So you go through the journey, and what you can't solve, you try to solve it with SDN and NFV. Right? So the point is there is what I call as an entropy or a technical depth in operator networks, because it's unlike just a deployment in a data center. You can just swap out the routers or the switches. Some of the operator networks really provide connectivity to the end users of the internet. Maybe it's running ATM DSL or a SDSL or any technology that we really try to support still. So the routers still live in these networks beyond end of sale, end of support, until its end of usefulness, right? So with a lot of entropy in the network, you're left with different routers doing different things in the network for different purposes. I mean, to review them, you need to groom them, remove older devices, but that may need a business case. But what is important is talk to your vendor, try to understand what could be optimization knobs, and look at different hardwares and for different roles. Do you really need internet table, a full internet table in your boxes for supporting some customers? Why don't you migrate the customers off? Look at options like the FIB TCAM size adjustments, or some examples I put in here for control of RIP to FIB that we have tried, but I would recommend you to really review your network design and then apply those, test it in the lab and apply those. So there are different optimizations you can carry out, but those would be just temporary fixes or patches to avoid routers from failing. Network operating systems is another kind of vector which we need to look at. So operating networks run different hardware, and over time you really buy different hardware models from different suppliers. So you have iOS XR, Junas, SROS, you name them. You have internet experts with certifications to run these. But we need to also appreciate some protocol features and knobs may look similar, but have subtle differences when you run across different operating systems. And even within a network operating system, you have behaviors change with software version upgrades. So it's prudent that operators need to really review the configuration and standards periodically with respect to these changes that may be there. I give an example of a very simple knob here. There are multiple things you can look at, and I just take the example of the maximum prefix limit. And you have an maximum prefix limit, which is really to protect against root leaks or to avoid any kind of prefixes that you may accept from a neighbor who's not usually sending those prefixes. So you usually apply it on eBGP, on an external peering or customer sessions, and it always works on the in direction. And so you have to propagate those routes into iBGP. I see wireless operators or talking to operators, very few of them really apply the max prefix on the iBGP, but the prefix limit configuration, the max prefix configuration also varies from one OS to another. For example, in Juniper, when you put a prefix list, it's usually pre-policy, same as the Nokia. You have another command to really do it post-policy. iOS and iOS XR does always at post-policy. So there are subtle differences that are there. And one important thing to note is if you don't apply a max prefix, you just accept prefixes until it sort of fails, because the limit is around 4 billion, right? So you keep accepting prefixes for Juniper, Nokia, and iOS, but iOS XR has a default limit. And if you don't apply max prefix, there is a default limit. So the iOS XR has a limit of 1 million IPv4 unicast. IPv6 unicast is 512K, but you have, if you're running MPLS and you're using IPv6 labeled unicast, then you have a 128K limit. So these are small, subtle things in fine print that you need to really notice, and operators need to adjust the max prefix limits. They do it quite well at eBGP. Maybe we need to review now the iBGP configurations if you don't apply max prefix limits for some particular operating systems, and try to adjust that according to the root scale or the root growth. So that's about the network OS example. So at Colt, we have learned from our past. We do a periodic review of a deployment, groom and maintain your hardware and software as annual plans. And it's always difficult to write a business case because you can't really carry out large-scale optimization and migrations in some economies because the cost of migrations are higher than the cost of the new box itself. But the goal is to be to remove older devices off the network. You can build business cases; it's possible. And the important thing is not just do it one time, do it as a continual process, and it has compounding positive impacts in your network metrics and NPS, NES, etc. So that's what we are seeing as our experiences with network optimization. And I just conclude in a philosophical way, internet is just not the network of networks. And I take you back 60 years with J.C. Licklider putting in his paper called Man-Computer Symbiosis. And it's well ahead of internet, which came in around 1970s, right? And you look at internet, he looked at a thinking center, which incorporates the functions of present-day libraries, but he also really thought about these network of such libraries connected with wideband communication and least service lines for individual users. So a visionary who talked about internet well ahead of time, about cloud and things like that. So put 30 years ahead, what would be the internet doing? I think it's a crystal ball that we need to manage. Its BGP is robust as well as it is fragile. So we need to take care of the internet. So network operators, suppliers, admins, architects, everyone need to really contribute to stable, reliable, and secure internet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny. So is there any questions? Yes, we have a question from Anurag. Can you share more about your experience with automation, WRT configuration of your devices?
Yeah, automation helps in keeping consistency. We have different layers of automation. We have automation for applying infrastructure code, what we call as infrastructure code, and we have automation for delivering services. So the goal is to really apply automation, not just because to do automation, but to have some benefits of it. So at areas where we have real benefits, we will do it, and where there are critical changes that needs to be done, probably on IGP or in critical areas of the network, we don't do it by automation, we do it via manual configuration.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? If not, oh, thank you very much, Danny. And thank you for all presenters for this session. Now, over to work.
Hi, everybody. Just one final bit. If you're interested in presenting a lightning talk, I'm just about to post a link into the chat window. Please feel free to submit a lightning talk for the sessions, and we would really appreciate hearing from you. Thank you very much for your attendance today. And if you could please fill in the poll that's just been put up on the Zoom window, how you rate this session, it would be appreciated. And as David has put into the chat window, the slides and presentations today will be available on the Apricot website if you wish to download and go and review bits and pieces from everyone's presentations.
Okay, having that, thank you very much. See you.
Thanks, everyone.